The first scream came before I had even finished handing my mother a glass of iced tea. "What have you done, Olivia?" Her voice echoed through the empty living room, bouncing off the freshly painted walls of the house I had dreamed about for nearly 7 years. My new neighbors had probably heard every word. I stood frozen beside the kitchen island, still holding the brass key that had unlocked my future only an hour earlier. "I bought a house," I answered with a confused smile. "I wanted it to be a surprise." My mother's expression twisted with disbelief instead of happiness. My father, Richard, slowly looked around the spacious four-bedroom home, his jaw tightening with every passing second. "A surprise?" he repeated bitterly. "Do you have any idea what you've ruined?" My excitement disappeared instantly. For years I had imagined this moment. I pictured my parents hugging me, telling me how proud they were that I had built this life on my own. Instead, they stared at me as though I had betrayed the family. I was 34 years old. Every extra shift at work, every canceled vacation, every weekend spent budgeting instead of shopping had led to this day. While friends traveled across Europe or upgraded their cars, I quietly transferred money into my savings account every payday. Now the dream stood around me. Sunlight poured through tall windows into a warm living room. A stone fireplace stretched from floor to ceiling. The backyard overlooked a small park filled with maple trees, and upstairs were 4 empty bedrooms, waiting to become whatever future I wanted. I had imagined one becoming a home office. Another could be a guest room. Maybe one day there would even be a nursery. This house wasn't simply property. It was freedom. Smiling proudly, I lifted the key again. "It's officially mine." Neither of my parents smiled. Instead, my father's face turned an alarming shade of red, while my mother's breathing became heavier. Then she exploded. "How could you buy a 4-bedroom house without talking to us first?" She shouted so loudly that my heart nearly stopped. The silence after my mother's outburst lasted only a second before my father stepped closer, pointing an accusing finger at me. "What were you thinking, Olivia?" he demanded. "You don't make a decision this big without discussing it with your family." I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. "My family?" I repeated. "Dad, I'm 34. I worked for this house. I paid every dollar myself." "That's not the point," my mother snapped, pacing across the living room. "A 4-bedroom house for one person is ridiculous." I looked around the beautiful home again, hoping somehow this conversation would suddenly make sense. "I bought the house because I loved it," I said quietly. "I've spent years saving for it." My father let out a frustrated sigh. "No," he replied firmly, "you bought the wrong house." Confusion settled over me. What does that even mean? My parents exchanged a quick glance, as if deciding whether to reveal a secret they had been keeping. Finally, my mother folded her arms. "Your sister Claire is being forced out of her rental next month." The words hung in the air. I blinked. "So? So?" she repeated, shocked that I didn't immediately understand. "She, Ethan, and the children need somewhere to live." My stomach tightened. Claire and her husband Ethan had struggled financially for years. Ethan rarely kept a job longer than a few months, always blaming bad bosses or unfair companies. Claire insisted life was simply against them, yet somehow there was always money for new phones, expensive clothes, and weekend trips. I'd helped them before, more than once. Thousands of dollars had quietly disappeared from my savings because I couldn't bear to see my nieces suffer. But every time I helped, nothing changed. "They're having a hard time," I admitted carefully. "But what does that have to do with my house?" My father's expression became almost offended that I had to ask. "We've been planning this for months," he said. My pulse quickened. "What planning?" He looked me straight in the eyes. "We assumed you'd buy a large enough house for Claire's family to move in with you." For a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard him. "You assumed what?" My father's expression didn't change. He spoke as if what he had just said was perfectly reasonable. "We've been discussing it for months," he replied calmly. "Claire, Ethan, and the children need stability. You're single, you have a good income, and now you've bought a 4-bedroom house. It only makes sense." I felt the room begin to spin. "You planned for them to live here?" My mother nodded impatiently. "Of course. We were even going to help you look for a house that would comfortably fit everyone. Instead, you rushed out, bought this place, and put the deed only in your own name." I stared at both of them in complete disbelief. "Wait," I whispered. "You were making plans for my future without ever asking me?" My mother threw her hands into the air. "Why would we need to ask? They're family." "No," I answered firmly. "You absolutely needed to ask." A heavy silence settled between us. Finally, I looked directly at my father. "So your entire plan was for me to work 60-hour weeks, pay the mortgage, utilities, insurance, groceries, and everything else, while Claire and Ethan lived here?" "They'd contribute when they could," he answered. I couldn't stop the bitter laugh that escaped me. "When they could? Ethan hasn't kept a steady job in nearly 3 years." "That's not fair," my mother interrupted sharply. "He's had bad luck." "Bad luck doesn't explain quitting every job after 2 months. It isn't his fault. It becomes his fault when it keeps happening." My voice remained calm, but inside, years of frustration were boiling over. I had spent countless evenings listening to Claire complain about bills while Ethan played video games in the background. I had paid overdue rent, covered utility shut-off notices, and even bought school supplies for the kids more than once. Every promise that things would change had been forgotten within weeks. I wasn't angry because they needed help. I was angry because everyone had decided that helping them would always be my responsibility. And apparently, they had already moved them into my home without ever asking for my permission. I took a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm, even though my heart was pounding. "I'm sorry Claire is struggling," I said, meeting both of my parents' eyes. "But this is my home, and no one is moving in." My mother's face hardened instantly. "So, you're really choosing a house over your own family?" "I'm choosing the life I spent 7 years building." My father shook his head in disappointment. "We didn't raise you to be this selfish." The word hit me harder than I expected. Selfish. After everything I had done for Claire over the years, that was the label they had chosen for me. I swallowed the lump forming in my throat. "Do either of you remember who paid Claire's rent when Ethan quit his warehouse job?" Neither of them answered. "Who covered their electric bill last winter?" Silence. "Who bought Christmas presents for the kids because they couldn't afford them?" My mother looked away. "I did," I continued quietly. "Every time they were in trouble, I helped. I never complained because I love those children." My father folded his arms. "Exactly. Which is why you should keep helping." I stared at him in disbelief. "So none of that mattered? It only proved that I should give more?" "Families make sacrifices," my mother replied. "I already have." The room fell silent again. Finally, I pointed toward the staircase leading upstairs. "I bought this house because I wanted a future of my own. 1 bedroom will be my office, 1 will be for guests, the others, maybe someday they'll belong to my own family." My mother's eyes narrowed. "You don't even have children." "Not yet." "So why should empty rooms sit unused while your sister needs them?" "Because they're my rooms." The simple answer only seemed to make them angrier. My father took one slow step toward me. "If you refuse to help, don't expect this family to forget it." I walked to the front door and pulled it open. "I'm not refusing to help," I said steadily. "I'm refusing to surrender the home I worked years to earn." Neither of them spoke. With expressions full of anger and disappointment, they walked past me and out into the evening. As the front door closed behind them, I leaned against it, my hands trembling. Deep down, I knew that today's argument wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The next morning, my phone began vibrating before I had even poured my first cup of coffee. The first message was from Claire. "How could you do this to us?" A second notification appeared almost immediately. "The kids are asking where we're going to live. I hope you're happy." I closed the messages without replying. Minutes later, Ethan called. I let it go to voicemail. His message was calm, almost rehearsed. "Olivia, I thought you cared about family. Nobody's asking you to give up your whole house. We're just asking for a little help until we get back on our feet." I almost laughed. I'd heard those exact words before. Just a few months. Just until I find another job. Things will be different this time. Every promise had ended the same way, with me paying another bill while Ethan found another excuse. By lunchtime, more messages began arriving. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in nearly a year texted me, "Your parents are heartbroken." A cousin wrote, "I can't believe you'd let your nieces become homeless." Someone else sent, "Family should always come first." It was obvious my parents had already told everyone their version of the story. Not one person had asked for mine. By the second day, the calls became so frequent that I finally switched my phone to silent. That afternoon, my cousin Hannah called from a number I recognized. Unlike the others, she sounded hesitant. "Olivia, can I tell you something? Please." She sighed. I wasn't supposed to mention it. My stomach tightened. "What is it?" "At Sunday dinner last month, Aunt Melissa told everyone that you were buying a large house so Claire's family could move in. She said you'd already agreed because you didn't need all that space." I felt every muscle in my body go rigid. "They told everyone that?" "Yes. And everyone believed it." Hannah's voice softened. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know you had no idea." After we hung up, I sat alone in my quiet living room, staring at the walls I had worked so hard to afford. The betrayal wasn't just that my parents expected to control my future. It was that they had already given my home away, long before I had even held the keys in my own hands. 3 days later, my grandmother's 85th birthday arrived. Part of me wanted to stay home. After everything that had happened, the last thing I wanted was to sit in the same room as my parents and Claire. But Grandma Evelyn had always been there for me. Missing her celebration because of family drama didn't feel right. When I walked into the private dining room at the restaurant, the conversations quieted for a moment. Claire barely glanced at me before turning back to her husband, Ethan. My parents acted as though I didn't exist. I forced a smile and walked straight to Grandma. "There she is," Grandma said warmly, pulling me into a hug. "My hard-working granddaughter." Those simple words nearly brought tears to my eyes. For the first hour, I focused entirely on her. We talked about her flower garden, old family memories, and the chocolate cake she insisted was better than any restaurant dessert. For a little while, I almost forgot everything else. Then I heard the sharp clink of a fork against a glass. My father stood from his chair. The room gradually fell silent. "I'd like everyone's attention for just a moment," he announced. A knot tightened in my stomach. "I know tonight is about Mom's birthday," he continued, placing a comforting hand on Claire's shoulder. "But our family is facing a heartbreaking situation that can't be ignored." Every eye slowly turned toward our table. Claire lowered her head, pretending to wipe away tears. My mother stood beside her, wearing an expression of practiced sadness. "Claire and Ethan are about to lose their home," she said softly. Meanwhile, Olivia recently bought a beautiful 4-bedroom house. Several relatives nodded, already knowing the story they had been told. "We simply asked Olivia to open her home to her sister's family," my father continued. "Instead, she refused. She'd rather let 3 innocent children face uncertainty than share the blessings she's been given. Quiet whispers spread around the room. Some relatives looked shocked. Others looked disappointed. I slowly placed my napkin on the table and rose to my feet. If they wanted to make my private life a public spectacle, then everyone deserved to hear the whole truth. I stood slowly, my chair scraping softly against the restaurant floor. Every conversation stopped. More than 20 pairs of eyes were fixed on me, waiting to see whether I would defend myself or quietly accept the blame. I took a steady breath. Since my parents have decided to discuss my personal finances in front of everyone, I began calmly, I think everyone deserves to hear the entire story. The room became perfectly still. I turned toward Claire. Over the last 4 years, I've given you and Ethan more than $12,000. I helped pay your rent, covered overdue utility bills, bought groceries, and even paid for school supplies when the kids needed them. Claire's face lost its color. I looked at Ethan next. Can you honestly tell everyone what happened to all that help? Did it go toward building a stable future, or did it disappear while you quit one job after another? Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It's not that simple, he muttered. No, I replied. It really is. I turned toward my parents. And here's the part no one has been told. Mom and Dad promised my house to Claire's family before I even bought it. They never asked for my permission, they simply assumed I would work, pay the mortgage, and support 5 more people because I happened to have a steady job. Gasps spread around the room. Several relatives exchanged stunned looks. I didn't refuse to help my family, I continued. I've been helping for years. What I refused was becoming responsible for adults who refused to take responsibility for themselves. An uncomfortable silence settled over the restaurant. Then suddenly, Grandma Evelyn placed her teacup firmly onto the table. The sharp sound echoed through the room. She slowly stood, her eyes locked on my parents. That is enough, she said, her voice calm but powerful. She pointed toward Claire and Ethan. Olivia earned every inch of that house through hard work and sacrifice. Instead of celebrating her success, all of you tried to shame her into giving it away. No one dared interrupt her. You should be proud of her, Grandma continued. Instead, you've rewarded responsibility by demanding even more from the only person who has consistently carried this family. The room remained silent. For the first time all evening, no one had anything to say. My grandmother slowly looked around the room, making eye contact with one relative after another. I've lived long enough to know the difference between generosity and exploitation, she said firmly. Olivia has been generous for years. What you're asking for now isn't help, it's entitlement. No one argued. My father lowered his eyes to the table, while my mother pressed her lips together, unable to respond. Claire quietly wiped away her tears, but this time they no longer earned sympathy. Even Ethan seemed too embarrassed to speak. One by one, several relatives began nodding in agreement. I had no idea Olivia had already helped that much, one of my uncles admitted. Another cousin shook her head. She shouldn't have been put in this position. The story my parents had carefully created was falling apart right in front of them. Without another word, my parents stood up. Claire and Ethan gathered their coats and quietly followed them out of the restaurant. No dramatic speeches, no angry accusations, just silence. As the door closed behind them, Grandma reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You did the right thing, she whispered. For the first time in days, I felt the weight on my shoulders begin to lift. Over the following weeks, I set firm boundaries. I stopped answering calls that came with guilt or demands, blocked hurtful messages, and focused on building the peaceful life I had worked so hard to create. Without anyone rescuing them, Claire and Ethan finally faced reality. Ethan accepted a full-time warehouse job, and together they rented a modest apartment they could actually afford. It wasn't luxurious, but it was theirs, and they learned to stand on their own. As for me, I spent my evenings painting walls, arranging furniture, planting flowers in the backyard, and turning my house into a true home. Every room reflected the future I had dreamed about for so many years. Looking back, I realized something important. Setting boundaries isn't an act of selfishness. It is an act of self-respect. Family is not defined by who shares your blood. Family is made up of the people who respect your sacrifices, celebrate your achievements, and never expect you to carry burdens that belong to them. And that is a lesson I will never forget.